Now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson will visit Sweden and Finland today to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine as both countries weigh up whether to join the NATO alliance.
It comes after warnings from US intelligence that Putin could use nuclear weapons if he felt the war in Ukraine was being lost. Well, let's talk to retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, who's here. Good to see you this morning.
Thanks.
Look, in terms of, and I know we've talked for a long time, haven't we, about Putin being backed into a corner. Will he feel like that? Because obviously NATO is, well, either before they join or after, NATO is going to be looking to protect Finland and Sweden, those countries with porous borders into Russia. Is that enough to make Putin feel backed into a corner?
Well, it's difficult to analyse the whole situation Putin's got himself into. It's a complex one, but strategically, if he wanted to stop NATO expansion, he's reaped quite the opposite, because neutral countries that for the whole of their time have prided themselves on being neutral are looking around and going, how on earth do we protect ourselves in the long term, and therefore having discussions with NATO. Tactically, by walking into Ukraine, he's tried once just to walk in, then he tried to attack Kiev and had to walk away. Now they're focusing efforts on the Donbass. It's cost tens of thousands of lives. It's devastated communities. The Russian military has not performed well, which is a source of great pride for Russia. And therefore, it's very difficult to see how Russia's gained anything from this enterprise. And it's isolated itself and diminished its standing on the world stage.
Well, you can see why Finland and Sweden are feeling nervous. I mean, the UK was one of many countries that promised that we would protect the Ukraine if it got invaded, if it denuclearised and gave up its nuclear weapons, and we haven't done that. Now, obviously, Finland is a member of the European Union. The Defence Secretary has come out and said we would protect you if Russia invaded, but without being part of NATO, can they be certain that we'd be true to our word on that?
Well, you're referring to the Budapest Memo of '94, which, of course, Ukraine found itself at the end of the Soviet Union, found itself the third biggest nuclear power in the world, largely because of the former Soviet Union nuclear weapons. It didn't have the launch keys, but they were based on the country. And in the end, Russia, America and Ukraine agreed a truce where the nuclear weapons would disappear back to Russia. And that Russia would guarantee the sovereignty of the borders of Ukraine, which clearly it's completely ignored. And 8 years ago it took Crimea, now it's invaded again. I think one of the difficulties in all of this is understanding how does it actually end? Because how does Zelensky ever trust anything that Putin says? So that's the real challenge, I think. The West is doing all it can. I think the UK is definitely leaning into providing military assistance. But there is a limit to how far we can go at the moment.
David Mellor earlier on was, I can't think what paper it was in, but it was an article by the Polish Prime Minister or President talking about having to de-Putinise Russia as Germany was denazified sort of back in the day. It seems to, unless he goes, there is going to be no stability, is there?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about this in the community. I was very privileged. Chatham House hosted President Zelensky doing a Zoom call. It was quite surreal for one of 1,500
Wow.
audience in the UK listening directly to the President of Ukraine. And when asked the question about international leaders talking about Putin and Russia, he very diplomatically said, I don't really care about Russia and Putin. I care about my country. And what winning looks like for me is returning the 11 people who've left my country and getting them back in the country, back in their homes. And he talked less about territory and specific leaders. There is always a maxim in the military, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And at the moment, you know, it does appear the victory in Europe parade, we were really worried that Putin might come out with some escalatory comments or drag NATO in. His comments were much more measured, and I think the military community, certainly military analysts now, are seeing that as a sign that actually he's modifying his ambitions. But even then, it's very difficult to see how this ends in the near term.
Well, exactly. And, you know, as you say, lots of people analysing that speech he gave on Monday. And overnight, the US intelligence officials saying that there's a bit of a stalemate now, that this is a kind of standoff. And the Chinese saying the same. This is a lasting threat now to global peace, and doesn't seem to be any immediate end to this.
No, I mean, I think the military operation, I think, as I said, he failed to just walk in, failed with Kyiv, and then is focusing on the Donbass. There's some fierce fighting there. Russia has poured most of its standing army into the area and its equipment. It's not performing well. The Ukrainian resistance is doing a phenomenal job. And the attrition that the Russian forces are enduring is not sustainable. By any Western analyst, it's not sustainable. So the question is, how far will they get before they grind to a halt? And then the really interesting question there is, having talked to a couple of Ukrainian interpreters, they firmly believe that because Russia's got a conscript army, morale is low, they're fighting against their will, that actually, once they do stall, Ukrainians will take a deep breath and then push them out. And the Western weapons, the decisive, accurate, smart weapons that the West is providing will have got into the hands of Ukrainians. They will be trained to use them. And now you've got some really interesting dynamics of pushing Russia out.
Yeah, but you see, now the problem with that is, though, because we're talking about, I'm no expert, you're the expert, but we're talking about a ground war, aren't we? We're talking about tactics of a ground war there. Well, ultimately, there's still this talk of tactical nukes, aren't there, which would remove the ground war element altogether. If that happens, he could just go, I'm just going to push the button.
I think if I may, the media make a lot more of the nuclear threat than I think most defence analysts or politicians do. I think I'm old enough to have served in the military when this was more a credible threat, and it was called mutually assured deterrence, MAD, because it would be mad for anybody to actually use them. The very fact you own them guarantees your safety because you're not going to use them because you'll be obliterated.
Well, yeah, but the worry with Putin is that he in himself was mad, so he didn't have that fear of being obliterated. But I think that's why commentators like us have been so alarmed by this current crisis as opposed to...
No, I understand that, and I think the analogy used about Putin being mad, I think one of the things that most military folks, so when Montgomery was fighting Rommel in the desert, he had a picture of Rommel on his desk. And why? It wasn't because he fancied him. It was because you want to look into the eyes of your enemy and work out what they're going to do. Most Western analysts do not think Putin's mad. If you study your history, you can understand why a landlocked country like Russia needs a port. Sevastopol is the jewel in the crown for Russia. It has been fought over for hundreds of years. So understanding Russia's paranoia about, as the Soviet Union fell, NATO's moved in. I'm not trying to justify Putin's actions, but I don't think, most Western analysts don't think he's mad at all.
Yeah, Sevastopol popping up in Tolstoy as well. It's, as you say, long fought over. OK, really good to get your thoughts this morning. Thank you very much, Sean Bell.